I hope everybody had a good weekend. Today's Monday. We're going to be going over Federalist number 22. It is titled The Same Subject Continued, Other Defects of the Present Confederation. It's written by Alexander Hamilton, December 14th, 1787. Topics include trade and finance, uniformity, a need for a judiciary, otherwise laws are dead letters. A new constitution ought to come from the people, and every state should not have an equal vote. And I'll get into that one specifically later. So there's a lot of this is a pretty long paper. It's also rather, I had the annotation that it was marked as a significant paper as well. They go over a lot of topics in this one. Starts with commerce, then he gets into, I think he starts with commerce, then he gets into voting, kind of the Electoral College a little bit. It's almost like a precursor to that. And then you got the judiciary, and then as well as, then they finish up from that the Constitution should come from the people, with like some very strong statements at the end where Hamilton just destroys and eviscerates the Articles of Confederation. So to begin here, in this paper, Hamilton begins with the issue of commerce as it relates to trade and finance under the current system. Hamilton's philosophy, which is pervasive throughout the papers, a federal government's power to help facilitate commerce both domestically and internationally is imperative. So, that being said, under the current system, Hamilton illustrates the need for a superintendence as it pertains to trade and finance. The need for federal superintendents is critical to the success of all states in the Union. Under the current system, only some states benefit. And he goes on to explain why only certain states will benefit. So, he continues, and I quote, "When talking about the regulation of commerce, the universal conviction entertained upon the subject little need be added in this place. It is indeed evident on the most superficial view that there is no object, either as it respects the interests of trade or finance, that more strongly demands a federal superintendence." So he's going to go on to explain how there's a need for the federal superintendents because of treaties mostly as it relates to trade, and then also a protection of the trade through having the military as well. So he states, and I quote, "The want of it has already operated as a bar to the formation of beneficial treaties with foreign powers and has given occasions of dissatisfaction between the states. No nation acquainted with the nature of our political association would be unwise enough to enter into stipulations with the United States by which they conceded privileges of any importance to them, while they were apprised that the engagements on the part of the Union might at any moment be violated by its members, and while they found them from experience that they might enjoy every advantage they desired in our markets, without granting us any return but such as their momentary convenience might suggest." So here what Hamilton's suggesting, he's suggesting that these treaties really are meaningless to this Articles of Confederation because any individual state can violate them and there's no recourse once they violate it. Thus, these bigger nations, because at this time we were a developing nation, they'd be less willing to get into treaties with us, and any treaty that they do get in with us, they're going to take advantage, and they're not going to help the United States out. Essentially, that's what he's saying, is they'll do it for their own aggrandizement, and in return they will give the United States nothing. Then he continues, and I quote, "It is not therefore to be wondered at that Mr. Jenkinson, in ushering into the House of Commons a bill for regulating the temporary intercourse between the two countries, should preface its introduction by a declaration that similar provisions in former bills have been found to answer every purpose to the commerce of Great Britain, and that it would be prudent to persist in the plan until it should appear whether the American government was likely or not to acquire greater consistency." End quote. So Mr. Jenkinson, now that gentleman, he was an earl, the Earl of Liverpool. His name was it was, I don't know what his first, Charles Jenkinson was his name, and he was the president of the Board of Trade at this time in Great Britain. So pretty much what he did is he came through with a bill. He introduced a bill to the House of Commons, which is their version of the legislature, and the introduction to this declaration was something like, well, we're not going to continue this, or we're not going to start this bill off. We have to figure out what the American government is doing, whether they're consistent or stable. Then we will go into this. Bill. Right now, it's a temporary order for our treaty. We will continue if there's consistency and stability from the American government, which says it all. Now, due to the lack of a competent federal system, the current assembly does not have the power to partake in a union-wide trade. Because of this, several states can form beneficial treaties with foreign powers that will only benefit that single state and is not uniform throughout the union. I'm not sure exactly how true this is, but it seems like through the Articles of Confederation, it seemed like there really was no enforcement of any type of rules that were there. So I guess individual states really could go and trade and make foreign treaties individually, sovereignly, with no backing from a federal government. And he kind of infers it with his next quote, and he states, several states have endeavored by separate prohibitions, restrictions, and exclusions to influence the conduct of that kingdom in this particular, but the want of concert arising from the want of a general authority and from clashing and dissimilar views in the state has hitherto frustrated every experiment of this kind and will continue to do so as long as the same obstacles to a uniformity of measures continue to exist. End quote. So pretty much what's going on is you have neighboring states that are setting up their own restrictions and their own prohibitions that are really screwing with other states, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. And then they're also setting up certain trade deals with different nations, from what I understand. And then additionally, states can put up restrictions and regulations on neighboring states in a capricious manner. Hamilton believed that for the efficacy of commerce, a federal government with the power of making union-wide treaties would be conducive to all states, and with a role of holding all states in the union to the same regulation would serve as a beneficial, or as a benefit, having the federal government there. So Hamilton alludes to the flaws of the current system. And I quote, "The interfering and unneighborly regulations of some states, contrary to the true spirits of the Union, have in different instances given just cause of umbrage and complaint to others, and it is to be feared that examples of this nature, if not restrained by a national control, would be multiplied and extended till they became not less serious sources of animosity and discord than injurious impediments to the intercourse between the different parts of the Confederacy." End quote. So that's exactly what I was referencing earlier. Is once there are, and it is contrary to the true spirits of a union, once you're putting these extreme tariffs of going from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, but New York to New Jersey, there's no tariff at all on the fish market, you're going to create animosity amongst these states, and then it'll eventually it will end in a disunion of the Confederacy. So then he continues, and I quote, "The commerce of the German Empire is in continual trammels from the multiplicity of the duties which the several princes and states exact upon the merchandises passing through their territories, by means of which the fine streams and navigable rivers with which Germany is so happily watered are rendered almost useless." So, and then he continues. Okay. So what he says first, just to break that down first, and then I'll get into the next quote. What he's saying is Germany, we talked about the Germanic Empire a couple papers ago, and a lot of their failings. Their republic, they had a aristocracy-like system. We had these really, really rich dudes, these nobles, they called them princes. They overlooked land. It was feudalism, and then they passed land on to people. Those people now have their loyalty to those princes. What those princes would do, they would tax merchandises that went through their territories, thus concluding no one would use the rivers or the streams that were so happily rendered with water, and now they're useless. They're almost useless. That's what he says. So people, it would really shut down trade, interstate, I guess you would call it, or interterritorial trade. But in America, if something like that was going on, then that is interstate commerce, and it would shut down all that interstate commerce. So you would have less products getting from one state to another. There'd be a lot more reliance on each individual state's commerce, or each individual state's goods and amenities, or commodities rather. And in doing so, if you have a bad year, let's say New Jersey has a really bad New Jersey, let's say we grew tomatoes, blueberries, whatever we grow. Let's say we have a very, very bad year, cropping wise, we can at least try and attempt to get some food from New York. But that completely shuts this down, having that high tariff or that high tax rate interstate commerce wise, which is why Hamilton is not in favor of it. So then he continues, and I quote, "Though the genius of the people of this country might never permit this description to be strictly applicable to us, yet we may reasonably expect from the gradual conflicts of state regulations that the citizens of each would at length come to be considered and treated by the others in no better light than that of foreigners and aliens." End quote. So really what he's saying is that you're going to get to a point, if this continues the way in which we're going, the road we're headed upon, if you are coming from New Jersey and you go to New York, you will be treated as well as a foreigner or an alien in terms of just trade, in terms of just being there and not being a resident of New York. They will treat you like you are not a citizen of this Confederacy. Like I said, it was not really a union. It was more like a pact between individual states, rather. So, for example, now in the current system, I can go from New Jersey to New York. Well, now they have all these COVID restrictions, but before all of that, I'd be able to go from New Jersey to New York, and there should be no issue. I'm not showing my passport or my ID at the border. I mean, I don't know what's going on right now. I know there's a lot of rules with quarantining after you go to other states that are outside of I think the tri-state. I think New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut. I don't know. They have this weird little state thing set up, and then New Jersey and New York are doing the worst. But somehow we're saying like people from Montana that fly over here, they need to quarantine if you go to Montana. Meanwhile, in New Jersey and New York, COVID-19 is rampant. So it's really just arbitrary. The reasoning's arbitrary, and it's just to make you look good on paper politically. And you have all these Democrat governors that get together and they all drink their wine with their finger up like this. That's essentially what goes on in politics. So then Hamilton next, he proclaims, and I quote, "The power of raising armies by the most obvious construction of the Articles of Confederation is merely a power of making requisitions upon the states for quotas of men." End quote. I actually forgot about this part. So he declares that this system's flawed because, to say the least, a lack of men created an auction for men. This method became way too expensive and unsustainable. Because, like I said, the Articles of Confederation set up this council, or this Congress, if you will, of individuals that made requisitions, almost like a quota system, like the taxation quota system was. Okay, so you guys have this many people. We're requesting, 500 people from New Jersey have to come and fight like for the military. And some states, really what it did was it started a bidding war for people, and then some states weren't able to match the quota. And if you couldn't match the quota, let's say the biggest threats, for example, let's say at this time was in Georgia, because there's the Native American tribes, as well as I think France and Spain. France is to the west and Spain is to the south of Georgia, and the whole map looked totally different. Georgia was like this big plot of land, and it was a combination of like Georgia, as well as, I want to say it almost went to like Mississippi and Missouri, kind of a little bit, that whole plot of land there, as well as I think a little bit of Florida, and yeah, so you have that. And let's say their biggest threats were, throughout the entire Confederacy at that time, if you would call it that, or let's just call it the United States for sake of making it simplifying it. You had huge threats from the West. You had threats from France, the Native Americans, the Native tribes, as well as the South. You also had Spain, who owned Florida at the time. So they would, of course, they would always reach their quota because they actually need the military, they need the help, they need the militia, rather. But these other states, like the state of New Jersey, they didn't have to worry about anybody coming from the Atlantic Ocean, really, because it was naturally created a protective border just because of geographical location. So they didn't raise anybody on their quota. They said, you know what, we don't care about the 500 people we have to raise. We don't, take a walk. And when that ends up happening, there was no way to even enforce it. The Congress couldn't do anything about it. The Council couldn't do anything about it. The Congress assembled, if you will. They could not do anything about it at all. And that's really another problem. They get into that at the very end of this paper. So then he states, Hamilton, and I quote, "In order to furnish the quotas required of them, they outbid each other till bounties grew to an enormous and insupportable size. The hope of a still further increase afforded an inducement to those who were disposed to serve to procrastinate their enlistment and disincline them from engaging for any considerable periods. Hence, slow and scanty levies of men in the most critical emergencies of our affairs, short enlistments at an unparalleled expense, continual fluctuations of troops, ruinous to their discipline, and subjecting the public safety frequently to the perilous crisis of a disbanded army. Hence also those oppressive expedients for raising men which were upon several occasions practiced, and which nothing but the enthusiasm of liberty would have induced the people to endure." Which is pretty awesome, that very end statement that he says, the enthusiasm of liberty would have induced the people to endure. He states that, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, he's pretty much saying anyone that was in a critical emergency situations, they would raise the men, and the people that were far away from the emergency or far away from the wars didn't really care, and they wouldn't raise the men. And then that, creates instability, and then there's not as much discipline and training going on with the military. So additionally, Hamilton claims, and I quote, "The states near the seat of war, influenced by motives of self-preservation, made efforts to furnish their quotas which even exceeded their abilities, while those at a distance from danger were for the most part as remiss as the others were diligent." End quote. That perfectly encompasses everything that I was just saying before. That doesn't really need much explanation. So, men not close to the threat procrastinated while other states were charged with too high of a quota, and if quotas were not met, there was simply no way to hold states responsible. So then it goes on, and I quote, "The immediate pressure of this inequality was not in this case as in that of the contributions of money alleviated by the hope of a final liquidation. The states which did not pay their proportions of money might at least be charged with their deficiencies, but no account could be formed of the deficiencies of the supplies of men." End quote. So yeah, if you don't have men, there's really nothing that you can do to pay that back. And the states, you could try. They didn't even pay their proportions of money that they were supposed to as well. And then he concludes this topic. By stating, and I quote, "The system of quotas and requisitions, whether it be applied to men or money, is in every view a system of imbecility in the Union and of inequality and injustice among the members." End quote. Which is meaning, there's inequalities, and some states have to reach their quotas, whereas others don't, and then that is in and of itself injustice because people are not following the rules and the law. So the next objection, so this entire paper pretty much is of the objections of the current system, just like the last one was. He's trying to go through the bigger and the more significant ones, and then the other ones he leaves the people to discern for, just because he only has so much time and so much space. But these are the most significant ones that really impacted the people at the time. So the next objection is the voting power amongst the states at this time. Just to explain it, you know what? Actually, I'll read the quote first. So he states, and I quote, "The right of equal suffrage among the states is another exceptionable part of the Confederation. Every idea of proportion and every rule of fair representation conspire to condemn a principle which gives to Rhode Island an equal weight in the scale of power with Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York, and to Delaware an equal voice in the national deliberations with Pennsylvania, Virginia, or North Carolina." End quote. So what he's saying here is, in this Congress assembled, you had the same power was bestowed upon each individual state, which did in a way recognize the sovereignty of the states, but it wasn't fair because there's some states that were far more populous than other ones, which is why it really isn't a it does not make it truly a republic system, because yes, it does recognize the sovereignty of those individual states, but then it doesn't recognize the population. So you need almost like an intermixture or a commingling where it is if you want a true union, you want a representation of the population as well as the sovereignty of the state, which is why we have the current system that we have, where we have the electoral votes. So for, like, I've used New Jersey. I believe we're 15. We have 15 electoral college votes. We have 13 House of Representatives, and then we have 2 senators. Every single state has 2 senators. So that part, the Senate, in its core and in its body, it represents the sovereignty of each individual state, because each individual state has 2 senators. So that automatically, that is 2 electoral votes, which kind of equalizes out some of those states with small populations, like in Alaska. I think Alaska only has something like 3 or 4 electoral votes, but 2 of those are from the senator, and then the other 1 or 2 are from the House of Representatives. And then it equals it out too, though, because then you have California that has a huge and Texas that have huge populations, and they have a lot of electoral votes because the House of Representatives are by a proportionality of 1 to every so many citizens. I want to say it's 1 to every. I want to say maybe 1 to every 400. No, I don't even know the number. I don't know the proportionality of it. But at this time, it was 1 in every 60,000. But who knows? Who knows what it is now? It's a lot. So that's why we have that system, the Electoral College. And here he kind of dabbles with the idea of it, but he never actually really comes out and truly says it. He's almost, raising questions to the reader about, how were we supposed to fix this system? So he continues, and I quote, "Its operation contradicts the fundamental maxim of republican government, which requires that the sense of the majority should prevail," end quote. So here, like I was stating before, he was alluding, Delaware is such a small state, small population, but somehow they have the same amount of vote as Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, which were much more numerous in their population at this time. So under the current system, the representation of every state is the same. And now Hamilton argues, and I quote, "It may happen that this majority of states is a small minority of the people of America, and 2/3 of the people of America could not long be persuaded upon the credit of artificial distinctions and syllogistic subtleties to submit their interest to the management and disposal of 1/3. So pretty much what he ends up saying is, I'm trying to think if he actually goes on to talk about the numbers, the legitimate numbers. He's saying that you can have states, like you can have 1/3 of the states, or 1/3 of the actual population of the entire country. 1/3 of it can make up enough states to beat the other states out that somehow have 2/3 of the population. So he's saying that's not really fair. And then he also goes on to say that it also should not be derived completely from population. And he'll explain this in one of these next quotes that I have. Now, essentially, citizens in the larger states eventually will revolt at this unfair arrangement and threaten the stability and welfare of the smaller states, causing anarchy. Also, this would leave the country susceptible to foreign influence. They would only need the requisite of a powerful few to run the country. And like I said, the powerful, you got a couple of states that would be able to beat out the minority of states, but they have a high majority of the people. So Hamilton states, and I quote, "The smaller states, considering how peculiarly their safety and welfare depend on union, ought readily to renounce a pretension which is, if not relinquished, would prove fatal to its duration," end quote. So these smaller states right now, they have the advantage, and they should renounce this because they know the safety and their welfare depend on the union just because they're so small in size. Like I said, if they have any issues commercially, then the bigger states can come in and help them out. Even in terms of the military, they need the military protection from the bigger states. And then he continues, and I quote, "It may be objected to this that not 7 but 9 states, or 2/3 of the whole number, must consent to the most important resolutions, and it may be thence inferred that 9 states would always comprehend a majority of the Union, but this does not obviate the impropriety of an equal vote between states of the most unequal dimensions and populousness, nor is the inference accurate in point of fact, for we can enumerate 9 states which contain less than a majority of the people, and it is constitutionally possible that these 9 may give the vote. Besides, there are matters of considerable moment determinable by a bare majority, and there are others concerning which doubts have been entertained, which, if interpreted in favor of the sufficiency of a vote of 7 states, would extend its operation to interests of the first magnitude." So that's a lot. I'm going to break it down. So what he's saying is, he's actually alluding to amending and also ratifying the Constitution. So you needed 9 of the 13 states at this time, not 7. 7 would have been the majority. He wanted 9. They were calling for 9. And he's saying, or 2/3 of the whole number. And that's also what's needed to amend the Constitution. You need 2/3 of the legislature, as well as the two chambers of the legislature. You need 2/3 of that, and then you also need 3/4 of the state, each individual state legislator. You need 3/4, meaning, these state legislators, they all vote. They go up there and vote, and if there's a majority in that state legislature, that counts as one vote, in favor of one, and then it goes back and forth. So it's not 3/4 of every single state legislature, because then nothing would ever get done if it was really needed. And then Hamilton goes into, actually, and there's a quote here that he has, saying something like, when there's an overwhelming vote for something, usually it's like the people have spoken. It's legislation that you actually want, because there's not often when that happens. If you think about how many amendments we have, I think it's only like 28 amendments to the Constitution, something like that, either 28 or 29. So he continues, and I quote, "In addition to this, it is to be observed that there is a probability of an increase in the number of states and no provision for a proportional augmentation of the ratio of votes." End quote. So he's saying at this point, we can have an increase in how many states we have in our union, and there's no provision to give a proportionality to that state or that new added state into the system. So he's hinting towards, are we going to go with an electoral college system? What are we going to do? He's kind of raising the questions for the readers. There's no current system. It's totally screwed up. That's what this entire, all of these papers, this one is the very last one of the defects of the Articles of Confederation. And then I think from 23 to like 36, I want to say, all of the writers, they talk about what is proposed in the proposed Constitution, kind of almost to rectify these problems in a more general sense, and then they go into each individual branch of the government. So then Hamilton fears giving the minority an absolute negative upon the majority. He mentions the Polish Diet, where they need a unanimity to pass or make any decisions. I don't know. I think we went over the Polish Diet a couple podcasts ago, how they need the unanimity in their voting system, and that's what he's referring to. And he's saying if you were allowing the system to go, so he's pretty much saying, okay, well, we can't have the small states, take over the big states, but also at the same time, we can't just have one dissenting opinion stop every piece of legislation that goes through, or any type of movements that we need to make as a country, whether it's, declaring war, making treaties, things like that. So he's kind of going both sides. He's pointing out all of the problems and the conflicts right now in the Articles of Confederation, and then they're going to come through with remedies in these next 10 papers. And then he states, and I quote, "The necessity of unanimity in public bodies, or of something approaching towards it, has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security, but its real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority, end quote. So he's gonna continue on this, and I quote: "If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of the majority, respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority, and thus the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings," end quote. This is actually interesting. I'm going to draw the comparison. And this seems like what it is on Twitter when it comes to LGBTQ stuff, any type of backlash. I think it was something like Jordan Peterson was selling his book in Target, or was it J.K. Rowling? I don't remember. One of them were selling the book. I think it was Jordan Peterson. He was selling his book in Target, and Target employees started crying. Oh no, this is I think her name's Abigail Schreier. She was writing a book on her studies of the transgender movement among young girls, which genetically seems to be much more of a male problem, where men, like young boys, are switching over to become women. So, but it's not really something that is permeating from young girls switching to be young men. That's not really going on, but she's noticed through her studies and through her data that she's collected, through her empirical evidence, that it's related to socialization. It is these groups of girls that get together, and it seems like all of them are switching over, converting from being girls to boys at a very young age, and that's what she wrote her book about. She's saying from girls to boys, girls at a young age, she talks about how they seek acceptance amongst groups. They're less to be individuals, or to have individualism at that age, and they need something to kind of not pet their ego, but make them feel validated, I guess emotionally or self-esteem wise. So these young girls, one will switch over, and then you see that all of them kind of as a group will switch over in these weird pockets, and they are considered anomalies. It's anomalous scenarios. So she wrote a book about that, because young girls are less likely to switch over and switch from being a female to a male, or a girl to a boy, or whatever the whole gender thing is. So she wrote a book about that. People that worked at Target were going crazy over it. I'm pretty sure they ripped it off the shelves. And not even the people that worked at Target, I'm sorry. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but the people that are on Twitter, the Twitter world goes crazy over things like that. And it seems like the minority of voices are the loudest voices. And at this point, and it's not because the minority, and then the majority is afraid to speak up. They won't say anything about it. They won't put up their dissenting opinion. And it has nothing to do with, well, it does have something to do with the majority being gutless, or just not having any type of intestinal fortitude. It has something to do with that a little bit, but then at the same time, it's because it's something that's promulgated by the mainstream media as acceptable and okay, that we're letting young kids switch over and use these hormone blockers and get these surgeries that end up being pernicious to their future lifestyle. A lot of them want to switch back, and then they can't switch back because they've already done these surgeries that are irreversible at that point. So we're having a lot of issues with this matter and this subject, and HBO promulgates it, the mainstream media promulgates it as a net good to our society, where it really is not, because we're ruining kids' lives. So she put up this book, mainstream media freaks out, all these people freak out about it. So this encompasses this idea that Hamilton is talking about, where he's saying that we have a large number that's not making the decision. The majority's not making the decision. We have the minority, the select minority, that is, going out there, wagging their finger, doing their whole thing on Twitter right now. And they're really making the decisions when they should not be, because there's no uproar from the majority. Because, like I said, you got the media exalting this like it's a net good to our society, and it shouldn't be judged, or it shouldn't be fixed. And you should just let this little kid make decisions for themselves. And as a parent, which is just it's abusive, really, letting kids make these pernicious decisions that are irreversible at such a young age. So that it's relatable to what's going on today. And that's part of the reason why we have issues in this country. Things like that, not that exact issue, but that's not, but that is a good example to the widespread what's going on among us. So then he continues on this front. He states, and I quote, "When the concurrence of a large number is required by the Constitution to the doing of any national act, we are apt to rest satisfied that all is safe, because nothing improper will be likely to be done, but we forget how much good may be prevented and how much ill may be produced by the power of hindering the doing what may be necessary, and of keeping affairs in the same unfavorable posture in which they may happen to stand at particular periods." End quote. So really what he's talking about is, and this is exactly what I was referring to earlier, when you have such a substantial majority, not only a majority, but like a 2/3, then you can all kind of rest satisfied saying all is safe, because this is something that it's proper. It's something that the people on a pretty widespread consensus agree with. It's a very, very small minority that does not agree with it. And the issue with having where the minority has an absolute negative, where they can pretty much shut down the majority at any time. So you can have all 49 states agree on an amendment, and then the one state, New Jersey, doesn't agree on that amendment, so we just shoot the amendment down. That's really what he's characterizing, that type of system, and it's completely flawed. And it does not work. So Hamilton uses war, and he uses commerce as well as examples. If we had to declare war on another country and we had one state that did not agree on it, or just a select few that did not comprise a 2/3 or a 1/3, if you will. If it was like, let's say 3 states out of the 50 didn't agree with the war, then we would have to stop everything we were doing. And not only with the war, ending the war as well. You have to also go through the legislative branch, I'm pretty sure, to end wars. And if we can't even end wars, then the wars will just continue to go on. They will be perpetuating themselves, and no one wants to be in everlasting, self-perpetuating wars. And then he talks about commerce, same thing with in terms of treaties of commerce. If you can't get any of that done, it'll end up being pernicious to the country and the union. And then he goes on to explain the difference between republics and monarchs in regard to foreign interference and corruption. And this is something that is very, very, it's interesting. He states, and I quote, "One of the weak sides of republics among their numerous advantages is that they afford too easy an inlet to foreign corruption. A hereditary monarch, though often disposed to sacrifice his subjects to his ambition, has so great a personal interest in the government and in the external glory of the nation, that it is not easy for a foreign power to give him an equivalent for what he would sacrifice by treachery to the state. The world has accordingly been witness to few examples of this species of royal prostitution, though there have been abundant specimens of every other kind." End quote. This is very, very interesting. So what he's saying is, in a republic, if you are a public official, you're not really afforded so many royalties where your life is this is how it's supposed to, where your life is really amazing. If you actually think about our public officials, if they did not take any money from these special interest groups, and they didn't fundraise and then find ways to embezzle and get it into their own pocket to clean the money up, like an Ilhan Omar. I mean, there's other people that also use their position of power on the other side, like a Kelly Loeffler I've mentioned before. On the Republican side, they use insider trading information to trade stocks, or Nancy Pelosi's done it with her husband before. He's an investor. She's on all these different financial and commercial boards, and then she learns information. She tells her husband how to bet pretty much on the market, so they win more and more money. That's all things they do, and those are all things that are outside the spectrum of what they do for their job and the emolument they get for their job. For her job, as a House of Representative or even a senator, I believe it's something like $174,000 or $178,000 a year. That's generally all they get. And everything else they're doing, it is really a slap in the face to the American people, doing those other things, taking advantage of their government positions, because it is something where other people are losing money on these deals and these bets, and you're really betting against the other people with a loaded deck, a loaded hand. Now, things that Ted Cruz does, for example, he has this weird podcast. I'm not a huge fan of politicians having podcasts. I just think it's kind of weird. unless if they're going out there every single time they're talking about why they voted on this or that, like Dan Crenshaw does. But his isn't. I don't think his is really a podcast. He just talks about the way in which he voted from the last time I understand. He might have a podcast now too, because they're coming up everywhere. I heard Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. She's gonna have one. She's probably the most conservative voter in all of the Senate in the entire United States. So, but if you have one, and that's what you do, you have your podcast. To me, that's not something that I would find as corruption, or I would even find as impropriety. I would not find it like really against any type of rule or standard or ethical code, because everyone that listens to your podcast, they have to tune in, and they have to voluntarily do that. No one is compelling them to do that. Whereas with these other systems, they're manipulating the system, but whatever. So if Ted Cruz makes a couple bucks on his podcast, there's really no harm or no foul on that. People are just listening to his podcast, and that is it. That's how he's making his money, and that's a voluntary decision for people to listen to his podcast. It's something that they choose to do. So what he's saying here is, essentially, in this republic, it's open to foreign corruption, but rather in a hereditary, because all of these people that are in the government, all these public officials, the power is really dispersed in a lot of different hands, so they don't have as much skin in the game. They don't feel as representative of the people, whereas a monarch, they have so much power held in them, and a lot of the time it's hereditary, so it's something that's in your family. It's like having a family business. You don't want to let that go, and you're not going to take, it doesn't even matter what country comes through. You can be, worth $5 million, and a country can come through and say, hey, give us $15 million and we'll take your country over. They're not even going to do that for that reason. They want nothing to do with it because they have so much skin in the game in that country. And then he continues on this note, and I quote, "In republics, persons elevated from the mass of the community by the suffrages of their fellow citizens to stations of great preeminence and power may find compensations for betraying their trust, which to any but minds animated and guided by superior virtue may appear to exceed the proportion of interest they have in the common stock and to overbalance the obligations of duty," end quote. So pretty much just saying, they'll be more interested in foreign influence or money. It could be domestic as well. I'm sure that's going on very often. Domestic influence, lobbying. So Hamilton continues using the example of Sweden. And I quote, "And in Sweden, the parties were alternately bought by France and England in so barefaced and notorious a manner that it excited universal disgust in the nation and was a principal cause that the most limited monarch in Europe, in a single day without tumult, violence, or opposition, became one of the most absolute and uncontrolled." So essentially what happened in Sweden is they gave up. I remember reading this and covering this with everybody. They gave about 20% of their country to France and England, and with no bloodshed, it says the most limited monarch in Europe, he gained all of this land without having to do anything really for it, without having to fight. So Hamilton next, he attacks another defect of the Articles of Confederation, and is a lack of judicial power, and this one may be the most prominent as well as the most significant amongst all of the defects. He notes, and I quote, "Laws are a dead letter without courts to expound and define their true meaning and operation." End quote. So if you don't have courts to define or to comprehend, say, whether or not they fall within the meaning of the main governing document, then essentially those laws, it's hard to discern, because some people may believe, and don't get me wrong, the Supreme Court does this themselves, but some people may believe that this part's legal and the other side thinks that it's illegal, and they're just going to fight over it, and they don't know whether or not to make it a law. They don't know how to figure it out, essentially. So then he continues, and I quote, "The treaties of the United States, to have any force at all, must be considered as part of the law of the land. Their true import, as far as respects individuals, must, like all other laws, be ascertained by judicial determinations." End quote. Now, Hamilton speaks of one, and this is this is the first mention of the Supreme Court, but he calls it a Supreme Tribunal, to necessitate union-wide laws and treaties superseding all state courts, and deals with laws of the land. In other words, the Constitution, constitutional laws, or between states, interstate suing, like we've covered before. So then he continues, and I quote, "If there is in each state a court of final jurisdiction, there may be as many different final determinations on the same point as there are courts. There are endless diversities in the opinions of men. We often see not only different courts, but the judges of the same court differing from each other. To avoid the confusion which would unavoidably result from the contradictory decisions of a number of independent judicators, all nations have found it necessary to establish one court paramount to the rest, possessing a general superintendence and authorized to settle and declare in the last resort a uniform rule of civil justice." End quote. This is very important, this entire quote. So what he's saying is, individual state courts, they can discern laws completely differently than, like, the New Jersey State Court can discern a law differently than the New York State Court. Therefore, that's what you need that's what you need a federal Supreme Court for, and also all the circuit courts of appeals that are below it. But and then he also goes on. This actually pertains to today, that you have, and we're talking about judges of different states have different opinions. And then we're saying the same judges of the same court, depending on the time, it could be 1 year or another, a couple years go by, and they can actually change their view on things. And this is, he doesn't, maybe he does it subliminally, but what he's doing here subliminally, he is alluding to human beings' flaws in their decision making and how they're differing on one and then the other, and then they're changing their opinions over time. And that's something that goes on in our Supreme Court currently. They've changed their opinion over what the founding document, the Constitution, what it means. Well, Hamilton feared that the laws of parts, meaning the states, would interfere with the laws of the whole, the Constitution. He believed that states would take advantage of their power. And he continues, and I quote, This is the more necessary where the frame of the government is so compounded that the laws of the whole are in danger of being contravened by the laws of the parts. In this case, if the particular tribunals are invested with a right of ultimate jurisdiction besides the contradictions to be expected from difference of opinion, there will be much to fear from the bias of local views and prejudices and from the interference of local regulations. End quote. So here what he's saying is, considering we have a compounded system, we have a state government, we have state courts, and then we also will have a federal court, they will be, you can't have a superseding of the state court on what the federal laws are, which is why we needed to create the Supreme Court. We need something to rule on those laws, and that one will be known to supersede the Supreme Court over all courts in the land. It will supersede them. It will also, in certain scenarios and instances, it will also supersede governors and state legislators and even federal government officials. It could supersede really anybody, the way in which they determine the laws and how they comprehend them. Now, Hamilton states, and I quote, "For nothing is more natural to men in office than to look with peculiar deference towards that authority to which they owe their official existence." So what he's alluding to here is the personal bias that you're going to have if you are in the state government or if you're a state court. You can't have a state court of New Jersey try something that is between New Jersey and New York. If New Jersey and New York are suing, or New Jersey sues New York, you can't have the New Jersey Supreme Court or the New Jersey Superior Court ruling on the case, because they're going to be more biased because they have a deference towards the authority which they owe their official existence. That state is the reason that the people that voted for the legislatures in that state and the governor are the reason for their position in their court position in the state, essentially. So then he begins to wrap this paper up, Hamilton. I have some long quotes here, but he just demolishes the Articles of Confederation and the entire thing. So he begins, and I quote, "In this review of the Confederation, I have confined myself to the exhibition of its most material defects, passing over those imperfections in its detail by which even a great part of the power intended to be conferred upon it has been in a great measure rendered abortive." End quote. So actually what he's saying is he's passed over a lot of the small things, and he's gone with the most material or the most significant defects of the of the Articles of Confederation at this time. And in doing that, he didn't even really need to go over, but he rendered these powers have been to a great measure rendered abortive, as in they've been useless. They are lifeless. They're written on paper, but in actually enacting and putting them, applying them, they're useless. They can't be done because there's no apparatus set up. And that's what he's referencing there. He continues, and I quote, "It must be by this time evident to all men of reflection who can divest themselves of the prepossessions or prepossessions of preconceived opinions that it is a system so radically vicious and unsound as to admit not of amendment but by an entire change in its leading features and characters," end quote. So here what he's saying is we can't just amend this Articles of Confederation. We need an entirely new document that has new features and principles and different elements to it completely. We need to scrap this thing and bring something in that's completely new and independent of this. So this paper wraps up at the end of this analyzing the defects and the faults of the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton concludes with statements about the current system as intrinsically feeble, execrable, and utterly improper. So he begins, and I quote, "The organization of Congress is itself utterly improper for the exercise of those powers which are necessary to be deposited in the Union. A single assembly may be a proper receptacle of those slender, or rather fettered, authorities which have been heretofore delegated to the federal head, but it would be inconsistent with all the principles of good government to entrust it with those additional powers which even the moderate and more rational adversaries of the proposed Constitution admit ought to reside in the United States," end quote. So what he's saying here is they have too many powers, this Congress or this council. They have too many powers that are in there, and even though they are pretty much lifeless and abortive, like he said, it's not consistent with good government to have just this one council that resides over everything in the United States. If you think about making the laws, doing the enforcing the laws, as well as comprehending the laws, they're essentially doing all the things that all three branches do, and it's only so many representatives. I want to say it was something like 80-something in this Congress assembled. And then he continues, and I quote, "If that plan should not be adopted, and if the necessity of the Union should be able to withstand the ambitious aims of those men who may indulge magnificent schemes of personal aggrandizement from its dissolution, the probability would be that we should run into the project of conferring supplementary powers upon Congress, as they are now constituted, and either the machine from the intrinsic feebleness of its structure will molder into pieces in spite of our ill-judged efforts to prop it, or by successive augmentations of its force and energy, as necessity might prompt, we shall finally accumulate in a single body all the most important prerogatives of sovereignty, and thus entail upon our posterity one of the most execrable forms of government that human infatuation ever contrived. Thus we should create in reality that very tyranny which the adversaries of the new Constitution either are or affect to be salacious and avert. End quote. So really what he's saying here, what he's saying is these people that dissent to the current proposed Constitution because they don't want tyranny, they will end up having tyranny because of the way in which this council works, because there's so much power given to them. And it'd probably be that we should run into the project of conferring supplementary powers as they are now constituted in either. So if we're not going to approve of the plan or the proposed Constitution, we should at least, what we should do if we're not going to do this, because he says this almost sarcastically, if we're not going to accept the proposed Constitution, what we will do in effect is actually give some sort of applicable power to this Congress and set up a better apparatus. And when they end up doing this Congress assembled, if they gave them all this power, he said, it will cause tyranny, because if you give that much power to such a small group of individuals, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is the saying. That's what will happen. So Hamilton also notes that the current system wasn't ratified by the people, thus it will be better to revoke the current document in favor of a new one, which he's right. So he states, and I quote, "It has It has not a little contributed to the infirmities of the existing federal system that it never had a ratification by the people, resting on no better foundation than the consent of the several legislatures. It has been exposed to frequent and intricate questions concerning the validity of its powers, and has in some instances given birth to the enormous doctrine of a right of legislative repeal. End quote. So in this Articles of Confederation, because it was created by several legislatures and not truly ratified by the people at large, it can easily be reversed by the same exact thing. It's almost like when there is a executive order, and this is the way it's supposed to work. When there's an executive order by a administration and then the next administration comes right in, they can just repeal that executive order. That's why executive orders are kind of garbage, and I'm not a huge fan of them to begin with. And then it's also it sets that precedent that if you think you can do something through executive order, then the next administration will come in. That's why I don't like executive orders, because it's kind of an abuse of power where you get more and more tyrannical. If one side can do this, then the next side, when they get in, then they can do the same thing. See, I don't like complete and utter power from government officials, whereas the left, they kind of like that idea of complete and utter power, and they just want the power in their hands at all times, and they'll just keep breaking the rules, or they'll bend the rules in order to give themselves more power, and then they don't actually think about what will happen when the power switches over to the other side, because they think that their plans are so good and they're so mighty and they're so virtuous that they will never lose. And then when they get rid of the filibuster like they did, then you get in Supreme Court nominations, when you get rid of the filibuster like they did during the Obama administration, when you needed 60% of the vote, you needed 60 senators. Now what you got is you got Brett Kavanaugh, you got Amy Coney Barrett, and you have Neil Gorsuch. I don't know if Neil Gorsuch got passed in by just a few, but you have all the other ones where they just need a majority instead of 60% like they do before. That's what ends up happening when you set precedents like that. That's why I'm not a huge fan of that idea. Now, he continues on this, and I quote, "Owing its ratification to the law of a state, it has been contended that the same authority might repeal the law by which it was ratified. However gross a heresy it may be to maintain that a party to a compact has a right to revoke that compact, the doctrine itself has had respectable advocates. The possibility of a question of this nature proves the necessity of laying the foundation of our national government deeper than in the mere sanction of delegated authority." End quote. So what he's saying is, if you're going to ratify this law by such slim means and slim margins, then the next group to come in will do the same thing. So if this was ratified, the Articles of Confederation was ratified by a couple state legislatures, then those same couple state legislatures with no governor, no executive voting on it, and no court looking at it can do the same thing. And then you kind of get to the argument in a democracy where the majority always rules over the minority, and then you look at factional violence with religious groups like Protestants versus Catholics, where the majority can always vote to take away the rights of the minority. And that's really what he's referring to. What you need is that republic, that constitution that already has those rights that can't really be taken away by man. They're bestowed upon you by God, is the argument there. So then he ends the paper, and I quote, "The fabric of America of American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people. The streams of national power ought to flow immediate from that pure, original foundation of all legitimate authority." End quote. That is an awesome quote. That should be put on a shirt or something. It's epic. The consent of the people is what an American empire ought to be built on, and that's the core foundation of it, is the consent of the people. And the streams of national power ought to flow immediately from that pure, original fountain of all legitimate authority. So he's saying, to wrap everything up, these are the core defects of the Articles of Confederation: judicial powers. There are none. They're non-existent. What else did he have there? He had treaties and deals. You need to be unified for those as well. For commerce. Lack of the compounding of systems, which is the need for the judicial power, and then furnishing quotas for military personnel, which was not enforceable. That's the big problem, is this whole Articles of Confederation. It does actually lay a lot of powers in that Congress assembled, but none of them are enforceable. And that's really the main takeaway from all these papers, is they are not enforceable. On paper, they look good, but they're not being followed, and you can't do anything about it because there's no judicial system other than violence. So that'll conclude this episode. Next, I'll be going over number 23, and that's going to be a change of pace. That is where we start, where they start talking about the proposed Constitution. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. I know this one was a long one. I appreciate everyone hanging in there. It's about an hour long, just because this paper was very, very long, but it does have a lot of very critical points and elements to it. So I appreciate everyone tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe. Make sure you drop the mic, and I really do mean it. Please like, share, subscribe. Like the page I put up on Facebook. Subscribe to, whether it's YouTube or Rumble, or whether it is any podcast platform. I'm out there everywhere, which that seems to be where I'm getting most of my viewership there. I have a pretty solid base on podcast, not so much on Rumble or YouTube. They fluctuate in numbers, but I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions or concerns or maybe ideas, even if you find some articles that you want me to cover, you find some information that you feel like the mainstream media is not covering, shoot it to me in an email. It's going to be in the below description. It's thefederalistfiles at gmail.com altogether. So yeah, I greatly appreciate the viewership. And thank you so much for tuning in. I will see everyone on Wednesday.